and let's ride into the heart of the old Wild West with another Purple Heart story. Chapter 1. Uninvited Guest. In Texas, 1875, life was a whole different ball game. Survival of the fittest, respect, and payback. Nathan Wolfe Reynolds knew these rules like the back of his hand. At 35, he was already a legend, a guy walking that fine line between civilization and the wild, with wolves that obeyed him like a pack of army dogs. His young wife, Abigail, a preacher's daughter who'd traded those prim Sunday services for life in the sticks with a real man, was still figuring things out, wondering if she'd made the right call. Gray Hawk, a Comanche shaman kicked out of his tribe, kept his secrets and loyalty close to his blood brother. And then there was James Holloway, a slick city slicker from New York with all the fancy gadgets. A tempting snake who would change their lives forever. A bone-chilling morning painted the Snake Creek Canyon in shades of blood orange. Nathan Reynolds was sprawled out on the frozen ground, his breath turning to white puffs of steam. He didn't look like your typical bounty hunter. His dark eyes held more than just a hunger for cash. There was something deeper, almost primal understanding of what was right and wrong. Beside him, like gray shadows, stood three wolves, Ghost, Storm, and Moon. They weren't just animals, but extensions of who he was, the living embodiment of that border between man and beast where Nathan existed. "Easy there, partner," he whispered as Ghost, a massive silver wolf with a scar across his whole left ear, whined softly. Nathan understood his wolves better than most people understood their own kids. "Our lowlife pal Mad Jack is gonna regret crossing the Brazos River. Mark my words." Jack Mad Harris was a special kind of lowlife. Not just a criminal, a straight-up beast in human clothes. His latest crime, cold-bloodedly murdering an old woman for a measly handful of greenbacks, was the last straw. Nathan had sworn to find him, no matter what it took. Meanwhile, 100 miles away, a fancy carriage pulled into the sleepy town of Ridge Creek, drawn by a team of purebred chestnut horses. James Holloway, sitting inside, adjusted his silk tie. His face handsome, with sharp features and observant gray eyes, could belong to some high roller on Wall Street. Nobody would suspect this polished gent had claws hidden beneath his impeccable manners. When the carriage stopped in front of the Silver Horseshoe Saloon, Holloway took his time getting out, letting the locals soak in the show. His navy blue three-piece suit cost more than some of them made in a year. A massive camera in a leather case was his ticket into any crowd. People were always fascinated by the chance to see themselves in a picture. Inside the saloon, Holloway instantly became the center of attention. He knew how to spin a yarn, his velvety voice, with just a hint of an East Coast accent, painted pictures of bustling, glittering New York City, where electric lights were replacing gas lamps and theaters put on shows people here could only dream of. "Progress is a freight train, ladies and gents," he said, twirling a glass of whiskey with a flourish. "Railroads, telegraphs, new factories. It's all coming your way. The world's changing faster than most folks can keep up." Right then, fate decided to play its hand. Abigail Reynolds sashayed into the saloon. At 23, she still had that girl-next-door grace and a curious look in her green eyes that really popped against the straight lines of her dress. The preacher's daughter, she still carried a piece of the decorum she was raised in, but deep down she was hungry for more than life on a remote ranch. She had always been drawn to what she most lacked in her black and white home: bright colors, passion, emotions, new sensations. Their eyes met hers, full of unspoken curiosity, and his sharp, appraising. For a split second, the saloon went quiet, like fate itself was holding its breath. "Allow me to introduce myself, ma'am," Holloway said, rising to his feet with a flourish. "James Holloway, photographer from New York. The best darn one in the business." here to capture the beauty of the Wild West for the Eastern papers. Abigail Reynolds, she replied, and there was a hint of excitement in her voice, like a bird that's just spotted a snake slithering nearby. Gray Hawk watched the whole scene. The tall, wiry Native American stayed in the shadows, but his dark eyes missed nothing. Shunned by his tribe for what they called bad medicine that brought drought instead of game, he had learned to read people better than any medicine man. And right now, his gut was screaming about the danger coming from that slick photographer. Back in Snake Creek Canyon, Nathan Reynolds had found something that made him change his plans. Tracks around an old campfire told the story Red Bill's gang, the meanest bunch of outlaws in West Texas, had been here. Nathan ran a hand slowly over the cold ashes, and his wolves exchanged worried glances, sensing the shift in their master's mood. The choice was made. Mad Jack could wait. This gang was a far bigger threat. Besides, the bounty on them was 10 times higher. Nathan couldn't have known that following their trail would kick off a chain of events that would turn the lives of everyone he loved upside down. He was just doing his duty, same as always, not suspecting that the most important hunt of his life wasn't here in the canyon, but back at his ranch, beside the woman whose loyalty was about to get a real stress test. Chapter 2. Temptation. Loneliness is a special kind of crazy. Abigail Reynolds knew it better than anyone. Every morning she woke up in their ranch house and the silence hit her like a ton of bricks. Her husband's wolves, usually sleeping under the windows, were off somewhere with him, and even their usual howling wasn't around to cut through the quiet. She often thought she should be used to being lonely. A preacher's daughter should be able to find comfort in prayer and good thoughts, after all. But something inside her was clawing to get out, something dark and dangerous, like a storm cloud on the horizon. She was young, beautiful, full of secret desires and a longing she found almost impossible to tame, sometimes close to impossible. James Holloway knew how to play that kind of loneliness like a fiddle. Like a spider sensing a vibration in its web, he methodically started spinning his web around the Reynolds ranch. Early mornings, you could find him on the hill with his camera, snapping pictures of the sunrise over the prairie. Afternoons, he'd be down by the creek where Abigail usually did the laundry, and sometimes he would watch her through the trees as she washed there. Evenings, his carriage would happen to pass by the ranch on the way back from town. "Amazing place you've got here," he'd say, adjusting the tripod of his camera. "Such raw beauty. They'd pay a fortune for pictures like these back in New York." His voice was like honey, sweet, thick, and smooth. Abigail caught herself choosing spots to hang the laundry where he could see it from the hill. Meanwhile, 100 miles away, Nathan Reynolds was still on the hunt. Red Bill's gang was leaving a trail of blood behind them. Burned down farmhouses, robbed stagecoaches, women and children left hurt and broken. Every night he fell asleep staring at the stars, thinking about Abigail. His wolves could feel his worry. Ghost would often come over and lay his head in his lap, like he was trying to comfort him. Gray Hawk watched what was happening at the ranch, knowing exactly where it was headed. His shaman past had taught him to read the signs where others just saw coincidences. He saw the change in Abigail's stride lighter, almost dancing. Noticed the pink in her cheeks when she heard Holloway's carriage coming down the road. "The spirits are whispering warnings," he said one evening when Abigail invited him for supper. "That man with the machine that steals shadows. He smells of lies and dirty money." But Abigail just laughed. Her laughter had changed, become brighter, younger. "You're too suspicious, my friend. Mr. Holloway is just doing his job. He's shown me pictures of New York. You wouldn't believe the buildings they have. They're taller than the tallest trees. Ah, how I wish I could go there." Gray Hawk kept quiet, but his heart ached. Not just because he saw the trouble coming, but because every smile from Abigail was like a knife in his chest. He loved her, quietly, hopelessly, like a man who'd sworn brotherhood to her husband. That love was his personal curse, payment for the sins of his past. The day Holloway invited Abigail to watch him develop photographs at an abandoned church on the edge of town, she knew she shouldn't go. After all, she was a respectable wife, waiting for her husband. But his stories of a faraway world, where women wore silk dresses and went to the theater, where streets were lit by electric lights and shops sold perfumes from Europe, had already poisoned her mind with the sweet venom of dreams. The church was cold and smelled of dust. "Let me show you something special, Mrs. Reynolds," Holloway said, pulling a leather-bound album from his bag. His fingers, long and manicured, not like the rough hands of the local men, carefully turned the pages. "These are portraits of ladies from New York society." Abigail, forgetting her manners, leaned closer. The pictures showed women in exquisite dresses, with elaborate hairstyles, their poses radiating dignity and a kind of freedom she could only dream of. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "Just like you." Holloway's voice softened. "You have a unique beauty, not like the phony polish of city women. There's something raw about you." The setting sun flooded the abandoned church with golden light, turning the dusty air into a shimmering haze. Holloway had already set up his camera on its tripod. "I could take your portrait," he suggested casually. "One that shows your true self. Not the frontiersman's wife, not the preacher's daughter, just a woman free and beautiful." Abigail hesitated. "I don't know. What would Nathan say? Does he have to know?" Holloway smiled. "Sometimes a woman needs her own little secrets, especially when she's stuck out here in the middle of nowhere, like a bird in a cage." His words hit their mark. How many times had she thought that herself, staring out at the endless prairie from her window? "Stand here." Holloway gently took her shoulders, turning her towards the light. "Let your hair fall loose. Yes, that's it." His touches were feather-light, almost accidental, but each one sent a shiver through her. He spoke softly, almost in a whisper, guiding her movements. "Turn your head slightly. Look at the lens like it can see into your soul. Imagine yourself as the woman you've always wanted to be." The click of the shutter sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the church. Abigail felt like something had changed in that moment, like a part of her soul had been captured on the glass plate. "One more," Holloway murmured, changing the plate. "Unbutton the top button. Let your neck breathe. More natural." His voice was like warm honey. Each pose became more daring, each look more intimate. Abigail could feel the blush rising in her cheeks, but she didn't want to stop. "One last picture." Holloway moved closer, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "The most important one." His fingers brushed her neck, and suddenly the distance between them vanished. Abigail didn't remember who made the first move, her or him. All she remembered was the taste of his lips, the smell of his cologne, and her own ragged breath. Later, in the darkness, as the developed photographs dried on a string in his makeshift darkroom, Abigail studied them with a mix of shame and awe. The woman in the pictures was both her and not her, a beautiful stranger with a dreamy look in her eyes and parted lips. "Your soul is now in these pictures," Grey Hawk would say later, when seeing one of the photographs. "He stole it like evil spirits steal shadows from unwary gawkers." And he was right, because from that day on, the old Abigail Reynolds no longer existed. Her place was taken by a woman willing to do anything for a taste of the freedom that the man with the camera had promised her. And Holloway was already planning his next move. Evenings, he met with other women in town, the wives of farmers whose land the railroad company wanted. He gave each one hope for a new life, photographed them in compromising situations. His camera clicked like the timer on a bomb that was about to go off. That evening, returning home, Abigail accidentally found a strange document that Holloway had dropped in the church. She didn't quite understand the numbers and drawings on it before she tossed it into the stove, but what she saw was enough to plant a seed of doubt in her mind. Somewhere in the prairies, Nathan Reynolds grew uneasy. His wolves sensed something in the air. Ghost raised his muzzle to the sky and howled long, mournful, like he knew something bad was coming. In that howl was not only the hunger of a predator, but the ancient wisdom of nature, which knows that every betrayal has to be paid for in blood. Chapter 3. Secrets. Truth is like a rattlesnake. It lies hidden in the dark for a long time, but when it strikes, its venom goes straight to the heart. James Holloway understood that better than most. Standing at the window of his hotel room, he watched the first rays of sun turn the dusty streets of Ridge Creek the color of old gold. On the table in front of him lay documents, land maps, sales contracts, letters from the railroad company, and photographs, dozens of photographs, each loaded like a revolver, ready to blast someone's reputation. "You need to know the truth about me, Abigail," he said later that morning when they met in their usual spot, the abandoned church. His voice sounded uncharacteristically serious. "I'm not just a photographer. I represent people who are changing this world. The railroad is the future, and it's coming here whether the locals like it or not." Abigail sat on an old church pew, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her shawl. In the morning light filtering through the dusty stained glass windows, she looked particularly young and vulnerable. "What do you mean, James?" "I help convince people to sell their land. Sometimes I have to use methods that aren't very pleasant. But progress requires sacrifice." He sat down next to her, taking her hands in his. "I want you to understand, everything I do is for the good of America's future. Our future." She should have felt horrified by his admission, should have stood up and ran. But instead, something dark and dangerous stirred in her soul, a desire to be a part of something bigger than a frontiersman's wife on a godforsaken ranch. At that moment, a mile from the church, Gray Hawk was creeping along the wall of the hotel. His movements were as silent as a puma. The years he had spent in exile had taught him to become invisible when he needed to be. He knew there was something off about that photographer. The spirits had been whispering warnings in his ear every night, and today he was going to find proof. Holloway's room was unlocked. Overconfidence had always been a weakness of the white man. On the table, Gray Hawk found what he was looking for, documents that revealed the photographer's true nature. Dispatches from the railroad company, lists of names, amounts of payments, and photographs, compromising pictures of the wives of local farmers in unambiguous poses. "Snake," he whispered in Comanche. "A poisonous snake in human skin." Abigail was sitting in her bedroom when the first signs of nausea hit her. She brushed them off as nervous tension from the past few weeks, but deep down she already knew the truth. Pregnancy, a word that could be either a blessing or a curse. Whose baby was growing under her heart? Her husband's or the photographer's? She didn't know, and that uncertainty was eating her up inside like a hungry wolf. That evening, the first open confrontation took place. Gray Hawk met Holloway on the edge of town. They stood facing each other, two predators ready to fight. "I know who you are." The Native American's voice was quiet, but it had steel in it. "You've come to steal not only our land, but our souls." Holloway smiled his polished smile. "Careful, my friend. You know what happens to Indians who stick their noses where they don't belong, especially ones who've already been banished for witchcraft." It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Gray Hawk felt the old scars on his back, The marks from the whips that had been used to beat him when he was banished from the tribe start to burn as if from fresh blows. Meanwhile, strange things had started happening in town. Jedediah Tucker had suddenly sold his land for next to nothing and left for the east. Mike O'Brien had followed him. Their wives hadn't been seen in public for several days before they left, and when they did appear, their eyes were red from crying. Holloway was methodical, like a spider spinning his web. He showed each husband pictures of his wife, beautiful, seductive, and absolutely devastating for their reputation in a small town. The choice was simple: sell the land at the price offered or become the laughingstock of the community. That night, Abigail made a decision. She couldn't stay here, not with a child whose parentage would always be questioned, not with a husband whose wolves sometimes seemed closer to him than she was. James had promised her a new life in New York, where no one would know their past. "I'm going away with you," she whispered, looking at her reflection in the grimy mirror. Her hand went to her stomach, where the baby or the blessing or the curse was growing. At that moment, Nathan Reynolds woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. His wolves were howling restlessly, and in their howl he heard a lament for something that had been irretrievably lost. He didn't know yet that he was rushing home not to his wife, but to a ghost, a woman whose soul had already been stolen by the silver magic of the photographic lens. Over the past 3 months, Nathan Reynolds had been tracking Red Bill's gang across 5 counties. He had seen their work: burned farmhouses where children's bones were whitened in the ashes, women who he found too late, their bodies so mutilated that even the battle-hardened sheriffs turned away. The gang left behind a trail of blood and pain, but Nathan was systematically, with the cold rage of a wolf pack leader, tracking down each one by one. He didn't take them alive, only dead, because such people didn't deserve to go to trial. When he caught the first one, the gang leader, he begged for mercy, offered money, but Nathan simply set the wolves on him. "Do you know why I work with wolves?" he asked, watching ghosts tear the rapist and murderer's throat. "Because even the wildest wolf is nobler than people like you. They kill to live, but you live to kill." He caught up with the last of the gang by the Brazos River. He tried to buy his way out, pointing to a bag of gold stolen from the victims. Nathan gave him a half-mile head start, then released the pack. The criminal ran for almost an hour, and his screams echoed off the rocks until the wolves cornered him like a wild boar. At the end, when it was all over, Nathan collected the gold and took it to the families of the victims. He never took a reward for people like that. Justice is not for sale, and revenge is not a job. It is a calling. Chapter 4. Betrayal. Nathan Reynolds rode into Ridge Creek at dawn. His wolves, gray shadows in the morning mist, slipped silently along the edges of Main Street. Something had changed in the town during those 3 months. He could feel it as clearly as his wolves could smell carrion. People looked away, hurried to cross to the other side. In their hasty movements, he could read fear, but not the usual fear that he always inspired in the townsfolk. No, it was the fear of people who knew something important and were afraid to speak up. "Reynolds is back," a whisper spread down the street, from door to door, from window to window, as a whirlwind drives tumbleweeds across the desert. The Silver Horseshoe Saloon was unusually quiet for a Thursday morning. Nathan walked up to the bar, and Tom, the bartender, hastily wiped down a glass that was already sparkling clean, a sure sign of nervousness. "Whiskey, Tom." And news. Behind him, in the back corner of the saloon, 2 cowboys leaned over their glasses, thinking they were speaking softly enough. "Damn it, Jack. Did you see those wolves of his? They say when he tracked down Red Bill's gang, he fed them all alive, down to the last man." "Keep it down, you idiot. But I've heard worse. Remember Butcher Thompson? Reynolds chased him into the canyon and held him there for 3 days. The wolves tore him to pieces, slowly. They say the screams could be heard in Fort Worth. Lord, and that photographer. If Reynolds finds out about him and Mrs. Abigail, shut up. Do you want him to? Nathan pretended not to hear, but his fingers tightened around the glass until his knuckles turned white. Ghost, lying at his feet, growled quietly, sensing his master's tension. Nathan sensed the falsehood even before he crossed the threshold of the house. Something had changed subtly, maybe the smell? The house no longer smelled of the dried herbs that Abigail always hung from the ceiling. Instead, an unfamiliar scent hung in the air, sweet, urban. Perfume? His Abigail never used perfume. She ran out onto the porch, and for a moment Nathan froze, struck by the change in his wife. Abigail had always been beautiful, but now there was something new about her, a kind of predatory grace, like a cat ready to pounce. Her hair was styled differently, her dress fit differently, and even her walk had changed. Nathan! She rushed into his arms, but he noticed how for a split second her body tensed before pressing against him. Finally! I prayed every day for your return. Her kiss was hurried, almost careless. Not like it used to be. Nathan felt Ghost at his feet give a quiet, warning growl. Easy, boy. Abigail tried to pet the wolf, but he recoiled, showing his fangs. The wolves had never behaved like that with her before. Hungry. She was already fussing at the stove, rattling the dishes louder than necessary. I was just cooking your favorite stew. Can you imagine? We now have new spices in the shop. Mr. Holloway, our new photographer from New York, recommended. She broke off as if realizing she had said too much. Nathan slowly lowered himself into a chair, keeping his eyes on her back. How she holds herself too straight. How her fingers tremble slightly as she stirs the stew. Tell me about the gang, she said quickly, too quickly. Did you catch them all? Was it dangerous? I was so worried. His voice sounded hoarse. In 3 months, he had almost forgotten how to speak, communicating more with wolves than with humans. Not a single letter, Abigail. Not a single word through passing travelers. She froze by the stove. I didn't know where to find you. And then, you know, I'm not very good at writing, lies. Abigail was a preacher's daughter. She wrote better than many in town. She used to send him letters at every opportunity, long, full of love and longing. The town has changed, he said, watching her reaction. Lots of new faces? No, what do you mean? She placed the plate in front of him, and he noticed how her knuckles turned white. Everything is as always, except for the photographer. But he's just passing through. Takes pictures for newspapers. Nathan scooped up the stew with a spoon. A strange smell, not the spices he was used to. Like the perfume, like the new walk, like the tremor in her voice. I missed you, Abigail, he said quietly, looking her straight in the eyes. For a moment, her face faltered. He saw something in her gaze that looked like guilt, like fear. But the moment passed, the mask returned to its place. I missed you too, honey. So much. Outside the window, Ghost howled. And for the first time in all their years together, Abigail flinched at the sound. And Nathan realized. His wife, the woman he loved more than life, had just lied to him. And it wasn't the first lie of the evening. In the twilight of the same day, Greyhawk found Abigail at the old church. She was packing some things into a suitcase, hastily, like a thief. You're going to run away. It wasn't a question. None of your business. She didn't even turn around. I'll tell him. The Native American's voice was quiet, but firm. He's my brother. He has to know. Abigail turned sharply, her eyes burning with feverish fire. Really? Tell him everything? And about how you yourself look at me? how you watch my every move, how your heart breaks when you see me with James." Grey Hawk recoiled, as if she had struck him. "You knew." "Of course I knew. Do you think I'm blind? Didn't notice how you like to spy on me at the stream when I wash there? Don't you think I see how you languish from jealousy and lust? But you are a coward. You hide your feelings behind the mask of friendship with Nathan. But James is at least honest in his desires." "Honest?" The Native American laughed bitterly. "That snake? Who seduces women to blackmail their husbands? Who sells their souls for railroad tracks? He offers me freedom," Abigail shouted. "A new life. What do you offer? What can a banished Indian offer?" In the ensuing silence, only the heavy breathing of both could be heard. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled long, mournful, as if mourning something that had been irretrievably lost. "I'll tell him," Grey Hawk repeated. "Not because I'm jealous, not because I love you, but because he deserves to know the truth." "Well then I'll tell him the truth too," Abigail hissed. "About your dirty thoughts, about your lustful glances, about how his brother betrayed him by desiring his wife." She turned and walked away quickly, leaving the Native American standing in the gathering twilight. And at that time in the city, Holloway was finishing his final preparations. The train tickets had been purchased, and the money from the railway company had been received. He even allowed himself a glass of expensive brandy in honor of the successful scam. But he didn't know, none of them knew, that at that moment Nathan Reynolds had already begun his hunt. Ghost and the other wolves were circling the city, memorizing the smells. Their master stood on the hill, looking at the lights of Ridge Creek, and his eyes were more frightening than any of his predators. "Soon, my good ones," he whispered, scratching Ghost behind the ear. "Soon we will show them what true fear means." Chapter 5. The Hunt. The moon that night was like a silver coin tossed into the dark waters of the sky, cold, indifferent, ancient. Its light turned the tree branches into ghostly silhouettes and made the shadows deep as the wells of hell. On nights like these, old men bolt their doors twice, and wild beasts huddle in their dens, feeling something dark and dangerous roaming the forest. Holloway's carriage tore through this primeval silence. The wheels churned up mud, the horses snorted, the wood creaked on the bumps. They were running like thieves, disturbing the nocturnal peace of the forest, and nature itself seemed to silently condemn them. Abigail, clutching the edge of her seat with whitened fingers, felt every jolt, every turn like a blow of fate. Her heart was beating somewhere in her throat, and a tight knot of fear twisted in her stomach, there where the child whose was growing. "James," her voice trembled like an autumn leaf in the wind. "Are you sure we'll make it before dawn?" Holloway nervously licked his dry lips. In the moonlight, his polished face looked like a mask behind which a completely different man was hiding, frightened, cornered. "Of course, dear. The train will be waiting for us at the station, and in a week we'll be in New York, where no one—" He broke off. A sound was born in the night silence, a long, mournful wolf howl. It floated over the treetops, telling an ancient story of the hunt, a story of how the predator overtakes its prey. The horses jerked, smelling the scent of their age-old enemy. "It's just wolves," Holloway tried to chuckle, but the chuckle came out crooked, like a broken branch. "Ordinary wild wolves." "No," whispered Abigail, and her whisper was full of such terror that the photographer had goosebumps all over his back. "Those are his wolves. That's Ghost. I know his voice." A mile behind them, Nathan Reynolds was following the trail with the relentless inevitability of fate itself. His wolves glided between the trees like gray shadows, silent and deadly. He wasn't in a hurry. The hunter knows that panic makes prey blind and stupid. Let them run deeper into the forest. Let every step bring them closer to the trap from which there is no escape. Patience, he whispered to Ghost. When the old wolf jerked forward, there was a strange tenderness in that whisper, the way a father speaks to a beloved son. Let them think they can be saved. It will make their end more painful. The second howl, now closer, made the horses rear up. Holloway cursed, trying to hold the reins, but it was too late. A wheel ran over a root. The carriage tilted and overturned with a crash, throwing the passengers onto the wet ground. Get up! He jerked Abigail to her feet. There was no longer that velvety softness in his voice that had charmed the women of the town. Now it was the voice of a cornered beast. There has to be a hunting cabin somewhere around here. I saw it on the map. They ran through the forest, stumbling over roots that looked like snakes in the moonlight, blocking the path of sinners. Branches lashed their faces, leaving bloody streaks, as if the forest itself was trying to stop them. Holloway was breathing heavily, his expensive suit turned into rags. Abigail saw the fear devouring him from the inside, turning the elegant gentleman from New York into a pitiful, trembling creature. And then the forest parted, opening a clearing surrounded by rocks that looked like crooked teeth in the mouth of a giant beast. The moon flooded everything with its deathly light, turning the grass into silver and the shadows into ink. There's no way forward. Nathan's voice sounded like a sentence. He stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and straight, like a Native American totem. His wolves emerged from the shadows, 3 ghosts with eyes burning with ancient, primeval fury. At that moment, something broke in Holloway. Fear turned into despair, and despair spawned madness. With one movement, elusive as a snake bite, he drew a revolver and pressed it to Abigail's temple. Not a step closer, Reynolds. His voice broke into a squeal, more like the cry of a shot bird. Or your virtuous wife will go to her ancestors ahead of time. Something flashed in Nathan's eyes. Maybe fear, or maybe that dark feeling that is born when a man sees another touching his woman. His fingers on the rifle turned white with tension. I know you think I'm a traitor, and you don't care about my life, but you have to know, I'm carrying a child. Abigail's scream tore through the night silence like lightning tearing through a stormy sky. Nathan, I'm pregnant. Time froze like a fly in amber. Only one thought was beating in Nathan's head, terrifying in its simplicity. Whose seed had sprouted in the womb of the woman he loved more than his own life. His gaze slid to Abigail's stomach, still flat, but already holding this terrible secret. Drop the weapon, quickly. Holloway hissed, and his fingers on the revolver were trembling like aspen leaves. And get rid of your damned creatures. Quick. Order them to go home. The moment stretched into eternity. Then, slowly, as if in a dream, Nathan lowered his rifle. Go, he ordered the wolves, and there was such pain in his voice that even the moon seemed to fade with compassion. The wolves dissolved into the shadows, all except Ghost. The oldest wolf seemed to have missed the command and remained standing next to his master. In his yellow eyes, one could read the same loyalty that centuries ago made the first wolf lie at the feet of the first man. Holloway's laughter sounded like the croaking of a crow in a graveyard. He pushed Abigail away with such force that she fell to her knees and pointed the revolver at the wolf. The shot tore the night in half. Ghost jumped into the darkness, leaving dark drops behind him, as if the night itself was bleeding. Now it's your turn, frontiersman. The photographer's voice was tinged with the madness of a man who had crossed the last line. How do you think it feels to die knowing that your wife groaned under me while you were chasing bandits? He slowly raised the barrel of the revolver. His hand was shaking a little, and didn't notice the movement in the dark. didn't hear the quiet footsteps behind him, light as falling leaves. Gray Hawk moved as if the night itself had taken shape. He kept his love for Abigail deep in his heart, as one keeps a sacred amulet, but his loyalty to his brother was stronger than any desire. His knife went between Holloway's ribs like butter. The photographer jerked, like a marionette on torn threads, but managed to turn around. The second shot rang out like the final strike of a bell. They collapsed together, the killer and his victim, connected by the last drops of their fading life. Holloway was already dead. The knife had found his black heart. And Gray Hawk lay looking at the indifferent sky, and blood appeared on his lips like bitter wine. Chapter 6. Dawn. Dawn came as forgiveness does, slowly, reluctantly, as if doubting whether this world was worthy of a new day. The snowstorm subsided, leaving behind a world cleansed to the whiteness of a funeral shroud. In this virgin purity, every drop of blood on the snow seemed like sacrilege, every trace an unhealed wound on the body of the earth. Gray Hawk lay in the hunting cabin, where he had been taken that night. His breathing was shallow and intermittent, like a shot bird. Nathan sat beside him, holding the hand of his brother in his, feeling the warmth leave the once strong body. In the corner of the cabin, Abigail was crying silently, and her tears fell on the rough boards of the floor like drops of spring rain. "You remember, brother?" The Native American's voice was as quiet as the rustle of falling leaves. "The day you saved me from the white men who wanted to hang me? You said then, 'The debt of life has no time limit.'" "I remember." Nathan squeezed his hand tighter. "I remember every day. Now my debt is paid. I go to the spirits of my ancestors with a pure heart." Gray Hawk tried to smile, but the smile turned into a grimace of pain. "Forgive me for loving your woman. She was like the sun. I could only look from afar, knowing I could never touch her. There is nothing to forgive, brother. Your love was purer than mine. It demanded nothing in return." Gray Hawk's last breath dissolved into the morning air, as the smoke of a sacred bonfire dissolves. His soul departed to the lands of eternal hunting, where there is no betrayal and pain, where wolves run alongside humans as equals. The funeral was short. They placed his body on a platform, as great warriors of his tribe are buried, facing the rising sun. Nathan wrapped him in his best blanket and placed a knife next to him, the one that had restored justice. Abigail left the next day. Her father, Reverend Johnson, sent a carriage as soon as he received the letter. She stood on the porch of their house, now their former house, small and lost, like a lost child. "I'll pray for you," she said quietly. "For you and for all of them." Nathan didn't answer. What can you say to a woman who carries a child whose parentage will forever remain a secret? He just watched as the carriage carried her away, and a part of his soul died with every turn of the wheels. And then it was time to say goodbye to the wolves. They gathered around him in that clearing where the final scene of the tragedy had played out. Ghost, still limping after his injury, laid his head in his lap for the last time. "You are free," Nathan whispered, running his hand through the silver fur. "You were always free. It was I who was in a cage of duty, revenge, and love." The wolves didn't move, as if not understanding or not wanting to understand. Then he stood up and shouted loudly, fiercely, "Go! You are free!" One by one, they dissolved into the forest, as morning shadows dissolve. Ghost was the last to go, turning at the edge of the forest to meet the eyes of the man who was more than a master to him one last time. They say that in the mountains of Texas you can still meet a man who is accompanied by wolves. Old Native Americans tell stories around the campfires that this is the spirit of a great warrior who knew love and betrayal, life and death. On the full moon, when the moon floods the mountain peaks with silver light, you can see his silhouette against the starry sky, a man dancing with wolves. Some say that it is Nathan Reynolds, who could not live among people after he knew the true loyalty of his wolves. Others claim that it is the spirit of Grey Hawk, redeeming his earthly love in an endless dance with the wild creatures of the night. And in a small monastery in the east of the country lives a woman who prays every evening for the souls of 3 men: the husband who loved her too much, the photographer who loved her too little, and the Native American who loved her in silence. Her son, a dark-haired boy with eyes the color of a stormy sky, sometimes wakes up at night from a distant wolf howl, and something ancient, something wild responds to that call in his blood. But that's another story. If you enjoyed this story, support the author with a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your emotions in the comments. Thanks.